It's so good to be with you guys. Thank you for having me here. And I say this every time I'm here because I mean it every single time I am here, which is that your community is a gift to me. Being in a church service where we sing lyrics where it says, like, I've got nothing to offer, God. I've got literally nothing to give to you. Creating a space like that is so refreshing to my soul. It's very similar to the culture that we're trying to create at our church. And always, anytime I'm here, it makes me feel a little less like we're kind of this like little church over in our corner doing our own thing. And it makes me feel like, oh man, there are other churches that are resonating with a lot of the same things of what we're trying to be about. And so being here is a gift. My friendship with Phil and with Chris that's been growing over the last few months has been amazing. I'm so glad to be here. I will say that the last time that Phil came, because Phil comes and speaks at my church pretty regularly as well, and the last time he was there, he did a phenomenal job, like arguably too good of a job. I had to then come back and try to live up to the standard that Phil had set. But Phil brings a very calm energy, and I bring a very I have anxiety in my body every second energy. And so I made a joke to our church about, like, in the middle of me being in one of my talking very fast rants, I paused and I said, I know what you're thinking. You're wondering where that Phil guy is at. And then they all laughed. And I realized that on some level, maybe they were thinking that. And so know that when I bring that energy tonight, that Phil will be back soon. We are going to be looking at a passage from Exodus 16. And this is, for those of you who are familiar with these stories, like the Hebrew people, right? They've been enslaved in Egypt. And then because, like that song that we just sang, about how God sees the oppression of his people and then he empowers and calls us to go and do something about it. God says, I've seen the oppression of the Hebrew people, and he calls Moses to go and be about it. He delivers them out of Egypt. They get through the Red Sea stuff, and then they're in the middle of this desert and they realize, we're in a desert. What happens next? And so we're going to pick up right there. This is Exodus 16. We'll have it up on the screen. It says this: Then the whole community of Israel set out from Elim and journeyed into the wilderness of Sin between Elim and Mount Sinai. They arrived there on the 15th day of the second month, 1 month after leaving the land of Egypt. And there too, the whole community of Israel complained about Moses and Aaron. If only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt, they moaned. There we sat around with pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted. They don't mention the part about the back-breaking slavery, but now you have brought us into this wilderness to starve us all to death. So then the Lord said to Moses, look, I'm going to rain down food from heaven for you, and each day the people can go out and pick up as much food as they need for that day, and I will test them in this to see whether or not they will follow my instructions. On the 6th day, they will gather food, and when they prepare it, there will be twice as much as usual. And so this is the passage that we're going to be camping out in here together tonight. But before we go any farther, would you do me the honor of praying with me? I invite you tonight just to pray a very simple prayer right now. Just pray, God, would you speak to me? And if you're not sure if God is there, then God, if you are there, would you speak to me? And then would you do me the honor of praying for me? That God would speak through me, that anything that God wants to do tonight, that God would do it, and that he would use me to be part of it. And so God, anything that's about to happen over these next couple of minutes, anything that is right, anything that's what you're wanting to say or do to any, like that you're wanting to accomplish in any of our lives tonight, God, would that stuff stick and stay, and just would roots grow deep from it, and anything that I miss or that's wrong, God, would that be forgotten? But what we need is you. Like the songs that we sang are good and they were played well and the lyrics were good, and hopefully this sermon will have something to offer. But God, we don't need songs and sermons. We need you and an experience with you in the middle of all those. And so we ask, would you speak? Would you give us the ability to hear? And not only that, God, would you begin creating change in us? Would you change our hearts and our desires and our longings? Would you give us the courage and the conviction and the clarity of how to follow you? Let me pray this in your name, Jesus. Amen. So I don't know how many of you grew up in and around religious traditions, or if you have like a spiritual heritage, or if you're pretty new to this whole church thing. I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in a suburb of Kansas City, Missouri, in a Southern Baptist church. We were like Bible Belt adjacent, and what that meant, well, it meant a lot of things, but one of the things that I learned from my Southern Baptist Bible Belt adjacent upbringing is this, is that Catholics are not to be trusted. That's fair. Okay. And there's two reasons for this. The first was that they prayed to Mary, and we weren't really sure what to do about all of that. But then the second, and arguably the more significant reason, was because whenever we were at the local Price Chopper grocery store, they were the ones that were in the liquor aisles. And we all knew, as good Southern Baptist Bible Belt adjacent churches, that Christians are not to be found in the liquor aisles. And so I grew up with this prejudice against Catholicism. And yet what happened as I grew older is that started shifting, because one of the things that I realized is, as a very anxious, high-wired person who has a hard time being still, that Catholics do a really good job of creating quiet, sacred spaces where the tension between heaven and earth, it feels like it's just like a little bit thinner. And that was really meaningful to me. And so I started gravitating toward those spaces. And then inevitably, because that happened, it wasn't until my mid-30s, but I ended up at a Catholic mass, and I had no idea what I was doing. Like, I had no idea how any of that works. You know that scene in like the movie where there's the person who decides to get in shape for the first time, or is trying to flirt with someone? So they end up in like an aerobics class that they've never been in before. And everyone else knows the moves, and they're trying to copy them, but they're always like a half second behind. That was me in Catholic Mass, where there's standing and there's sitting, and then like the priest will say something, and then there's like a paragraph of stuff that people say after, and I don't know the paragraph, so I'm just trying to keep up with all of it. And there was only one part that I knew that there was going to be a part where the priest was going to say, "Peace be with you," and I was ready for that part, because that one I had down. And so I waited for it, and then it came, and he says, "Peace be with you," and I puffed out my chest, and I said, "And also with you." They changed it. They changed that part. That part they now say, "and with your spirit." So the one thing that I thought I had right, I completely had wrong. And I'm sharing all that because what I want to talk about tonight is like what I really appreciate, what I've grown to appreciate, even in that awkward experience, what I've grown to appreciate about the way that the Catholic Mass, even if I don't agree with all of it, and I don't, but like what I've learned to appreciate about it is the intentionality of every single thing that happens in those is all designed to point toward a bigger reality about who God is or about who we are. Every single piece of it, every single thing that happens, including like sometimes the shape of the room you're in is like literally in a cross, because every single thing that is happening is trying to communicate something that's true about who God is or about who we are. And there's a word for that. And when I gave this talk at my church, I felt like I had to explain that. And in my notes, I still have me explaining this word. And the word is liturgy. But here's what I realized tonight is that I'm in a church that has already name-checked Epiphany, Lent, Fat Tuesday, and Ash Wednesday, and that maybe y'all are a little bit more familiar with liturgy. And so I'm not going to camp out in this quite as long, but just to catch everyone else up in case you're not familiar with, what is a liturgy? A liturgy is a series of habits and practices that declare what is true about reality. And so a Catholic Mass is going to have, this is one of the appeals of it to some people, or if you've ever been to an Anglican church or churches where there is a set liturgical practice and it happens the same way every single time. And there's for some people something beautiful that comes from the repetition of all of that. And everything is designed to communicate something that is true about God or about ourselves. But the reality is, every church you have ever been to has a liturgy. It's just a question of whether they know it or not. Like my church has a liturgy. Like we do, I mean, I could walk you through the whole thing. I won't. But like, for instance, part of our liturgy is like, for me, before I stepped into being the pastor of my church, I was deeply frustrated to the point of maybe being done with the church by how I saw Christianity in general engaging with our cultural moment over the last like 10 years or so. And I was just done. I was just over it. And then kind of God brought me back and I ended up being the pastor of a church again, which is a whole other story. But I wrote a benediction because I was like, how are we going to be different? Because just me getting up there and like every once in a while giving a sermon isn't going to make a dent in that. And so we wrote a benediction, and we say this benediction every week. And part of our benediction says this: may you remember that Jesus was not the property of any political party, and that we are to love our neighbor, which includes those we passionately disagree with. And we say that every week as our liturgy. Why? because we want to ingrain something that is true about God and true about ourselves into our minds so that we remember it. Because liturgies are they're creating habits and practices that are declaring what is true. And so here's what I want to talk about, is that in the same ways that a church has a liturgy, in the same way that TNL has a liturgy, in the same way that Catholic masses have a liturgy, our lives have a liturgy to them too. Like, we have routines, we have habits, and we have practices that we've built into our day. And it's important to be clear on this front, that our life's liturgy is declaring what we believe to be true about reality. That our life's liturgy is declaring what we believe to be true about reality, that the habits, that the practices, that the way that we've built out our day is declaring, whether we realize it or not, whether we know it or not, whether we feel like we chose the habits or practices that we have, or whether we feel like they were chosen for us, they are all declaring what we believe to be true about reality. And so the two questions that we're going to be asking tonight are going to be these. What is my liturgy? And what does my liturgy say of what I believe about reality? Okay, so what does this have to do at all with that passage that we read from Exodus? As we look through that passage, here's what I believe God is doing. You have a Hebrew people, right? And the Hebrew people, they have been living in slavery for hundreds of years. And in all of that, the only culture that they are knowing and experiencing is the culture of an empire. The thing that they know best are the empire's gods and the ways that those empire's gods act and behave. The things that they know best are an economy that is an empire's economy. The things that they know best are the ideas and the practices and the values of that empire. You'll remember that when God eventually shows up, Moses is like, who do I tell them that you are? No one knows really anything about you. These are a people who have been living entirely under the values, I would even say like the liturgy of an empire. And so what do empires do? Well, empires abuse, they enslave, they exploit, and then they call that the good life. And this is what Israel knew. This is what was in their bones. This is what they had lived in for generations. And here's what I think is happening as we look at the story that we looked at tonight. What I think we see God doing is this, is inviting the Hebrew people out of one way of thinking, one set of habits and practices that was all that they had ever known, inviting them out of that and into something better. And so what do we see happening? God, like they're out in a desert, and what is the first thing that they immediately do in the desert? They want to return to the rhythm that they knew before. Yes, they were enslaved. Yes, it was terrible for them. Yes, it was destroying them from the inside out. Yes, it was literally killing them. And yet they want to return to that because that's what's familiar. And what God is saying is like, hold on, we're going to do something different here. And so not only does God invite them out into the desert and trusting him in that, he then says, here's the deal. I'm going to take care of you and I'm going to feed you, but the way I'm going to do it is going to be very different. There's only going to be enough food on the ground for today. And then you're going to wake up the next day and there's going to be food on the ground. And you're going to wake up the next day and there's going to be food on the ground. And you are going to have to learn how to trust me. And here's the deal. I used to read this story and it felt like God was just kind of being like a little controlling, where he's just like, it's like a power trip or something like that, right? And here's what I've been thinking. I think what's happening is that God is inviting the Hebrew people into a much better story than the only story that they ever knew. Because see, in God's liturgy, God cares about their everyday needs. They already knew him as the God who showed up in the extraordinary moments. We're like this sometimes too, right? Like when life gets really hard, when we're really desperate, when we need God to show up in big ways, we like turn to God like, God, save me. And like, that's like kind of the God that we know. And they knew this God because this was the God that like parted the Red Sea for them in the moment when like the soldiers are all about to kill them. But this is a God who cares about the everyday simple needs of like, where is our food going to come from? See, in God's liturgy, rest is possible even in the middle of scarcity. Like they're in a desert. Imagine being a parent with kids and you're in the middle of a desert where you really do not know how you are going to feed your kids the next day. Imagine the anxiety that that would provoke. And yet in all of this, God is trying to say, there is a way for you in the middle of a busy and hectic and chaotic and scary world where it feels like there is not enough to go around. It is possible for you to rest in the middle of that because I'm going to provide. See, in God's liturgy, God is reliable and dependable. And that's very different than the Egyptian gods, which are the only gods that like a lot of the Hebrew people knew. These are the gods who like the Nile flooded, it killed a bunch of people. It's like, well, someone probably made one of the gods mad. It's like, oh man, wow, we must have done something right. There was like a great harvest. We must have done something wrong. There was a terrible harvest. The gods are fickle. They are not to be trusted. It's hard to know what's going to get their attention, what's not. And God is trying to invite them out of that and into a liturgy where he's like, I'm the same every single day and can be trusted. And then a big one, I think this is huge, is that in God's liturgy, hoarding is not allowed. Why? Because hoarding is at the root of exploitation. Think about every problem that is happening, like massive problem happening in the world right now, and how many of them trace themselves back to someone thinking that there's not enough to go around and they have to fight for what's theirs. Think about how that happens interpersonally. There's not enough love to go around. There's not enough food to go around. There's not enough money to go around. There's not enough job promotions to go around. There's not enough spots on the team to go around. There's not a spot, whatever it is. There's not enough to go around. And out of that comes fear and anxiety and anger and pride. Where do wars and fighting, James is going to say this, where do wars and fightings come? Don't they come from your own evil desires within you that war and kill to get what's yours? And God is saying, like, here's the deal. The empire that you know, the empire that's taught you everything, that empire has an entire way of thinking that's like you have to fight and grab power to get what's yours. And he's saying that is not how it's going to be for you to be my people. And we have to remember in all this, why is this so significant for God to try to teach the Hebrew people a new liturgy? Because God had told Abraham, I'm going to make your descendants into a great nation. But it wasn't just that. He said, and through that great nation, all the world is going to be blessed. So what's going to happen to the Hebrew people who only know the habits of empire if they become a nation? They're going to resort back to being just like every other empire who has existed. And the rules of empire, the liturgy of empire, are death to the world. And so God is inviting his people. He's like, I want to train you to live in a different reality, to develop a new liturgy of how you go about your day-to-day life that is going to turn you into a different kind of people that can be a blessing to the world. Okay, you're smart. You probably have figured out where I'm going with this, at least a little bit. But let's bring this back to us. Because here's what I believe, is that God is inviting us to create liturgies for our life that reflect the reality of God's kingdom, not the realities of an empire. And so let's talk about what the liturgies of our life look like. And specifically, we're just going to talk about what the morning rhythms, the morning liturgies of our life look like. Because if we try to talk about our whole day, it'll take way too long. So we're just going to focus on the morning. Let's talk about what your morning liturgy looks like. If you are here and you don't have kids, maybe not for those of you who are in school, but like adults, if you don't have kids, like you more or less can get up more or less whenever you want. You have to get to work on time, but you can kind of choose that. If you have kids, whenever you get up, it's about an hour earlier than you would have preferred to get up. If you had kids and then have graduated out of that life stage, then you get up at 4 a.m. because your kids broke you and you can't sleep in anymore. But then, okay, let's talk about what our morning rhythms and routines, our morning liturgies look like. How many for you, a part of your morning liturgy is breakfast? Show of hands. Good, most important meal of the day. Some of you will talk after. Show of hands, how many of your morning liturgy is preparing stuff for your kids so they can be ready for their day? Yeah. Morning liturgy of exercise. Yeah, me neither, I know. One of you, good job, way to go. You're better than the rest of us. Morning liturgy of coffee. Yeah. One hand for exercise. Coffee, we all, yes. Praise be. Morning liturgy of news. Checking the news. Oh, wow, no. Okay, only one person. Okay. Okay, we'll see if I get you with this one. Morning liturgy of checking social media. There was some where the hands went way up, and then the social media one, I got this. Like there was embarrassment, there was shame in the room. Here's what I want to say this morning. Your morning liturgy probably isn't, like, let's not call it good or bad. Let's talk of it being a mix of a lot of things. And there's a good chance you don't feel like you chose it. There's a good chance you feel like your liturgy was chosen for you. But here's what I want to say. We have more control over forming the liturgies of our lives than we think. Now, if you have really young kids, I will acknowledge that's a hard time. That's a hard time. Like, your liturgy kind of is determined for you a little bit. But what I would say is, even in that stage, and for most of us, we have far more control over shaping what our days look like than we think. The problem is that we live in an empire that has spent a lot of time and money trying to make sure that we are on its agenda, not ours. And the biggest, and you know this, you're smart, but the biggest culprit of it is this guy. This thing is the thing that tethers you to your work and says the moment you wake up, you check your email to see if anything came in at work so that you can be prepped for whatever is about to come around the bend as you go into the office. And in all of that, what it is teaching you is you are only as valuable as you are productive. Whose mentality is that? God's or the empire's? This is the thing that tells us you're feeling negative emotions, you're feeling negative feelings, you're feeling anxiety, you're feeling something. Guess what? Dopamine hit right here, and it will make that feeling go away for a tiny bit. It'll be worse later, but don't think about that. This thing is going to make you feel better right in the moment. It will help you escape from reality. That's the empire. This thing is going to tell you anytime that you are feeling anxious, come and give your attention to it. And here's the deal. It feels like a really good deal because a lot of the things on here are free. And again, I know you know this, but I want to remind you, nothing on your phone is free. If something on your phone is free, you're the product that is being bought and sold. And it's not just our phones, it's the whole world and the system that we live in that tells you you are only as valuable as your productivity, you are only as valuable as the ways that you did something for other people to keep them from leaving, that you are only as good as busy as you were. How much of your morning liturgy is connected to frantic doing? How many of you, your morning liturgy has a feeling of never enough, not good enough, not enough time, not enough to go around? That's the liturgy of an empire. And our morning liturgies are saying something about reality. How many of you, your morning rhythms, your morning routines, your morning liturgies sound like this? I have to move fast or I'll fall behind. And then I'll fail. And we don't really know what's going to happen after that. Probably the apocalypse. It's hard to tell. We're not going to let it happen. I have to be disciplined because only disciplined people are successful people. I have to help my family so that they know I love them, or so they'll know that I'm a good mom and dad and I'll feel loved and valuable. Or based on the show of hands earlier, our liturgy maybe sounds like this. Where does my help come from? It comes from the coffee, the waker of the body and spirit. What I want to ask you this morning, and maybe your liturgy connects with some of the things that I just said, maybe especially because our church cultures are different, maybe for you, you're in a little bit of a different space when you think about your morning routine. What I want to ask you this though is whether I nailed it or not, what I want to ask you is this: what are the feelings that your morning routine, that your morning liturgy creates for you? Is your morning liturgy and what it declares about reality, is it centering you on something that is true and good and life-giving? Or is it centering you on escape, on hyperproductivity, on anxiety and fear, or the avoidance of anxiety and fear? These are the messages of empire. And what I want to ask you is this, is to what extent Does your morning's liturgy communicate that there is a God in heaven who rules over everything and that you can trust that God with your life? I think so often, and maybe now you're realizing, wait a minute, this just feels like a talk that you just smuggled in to talk about like spiritual habits and practices. You're going to talk about like Bible reading next, right? Like maybe, you don't know me, just we'll see what happens. But a lot of times when we start getting into this kind of territory, here's what it starts to feel like, especially for those of you who've got like religious issues, me, it starts feeling like pressure. It starts feeling like guilt. It starts pressuring like you should. It starts feeling like you need to do this to make God happy. You need to do this to be a good person. There's pressure that comes around it, and I want to eliminate that. Eliminate it. Get rid of it. If you're feeling that right now, just put it off to the side because that is not what we are saying. What we are saying tonight is this. God is not trying to invite the Israelites into being good little boys and girls who follow all the rules. He's trying to invite them out of death and into life. He's trying to invite them out of something that is soul-crushing and into something that is life-giving. He's trying to invite them out of something that kills into something that brings beauty. And what I want to ask you is not, are you being a good little Christian boy or girl? Are you getting all your gold stars? Are you doing all the right things? I'm not saying that. I'm saying, to what extent are you building habits and patterns in your morning that breathe spiritual joy and life? Because what God's heart and intent for you is not to control you. What God's heart and intent for you is to bring you life and joy and peace. And so my question is, to what extent are your morning habits and practices, your morning liturgies, fostering that in you? What would it look like for you to build your morning around the belief that you can know and experience the God who holds everything together? What's challenging about me giving this talk is I am not by nature a disciplined person. I feel guilty about that most of the time and then spend the rest of my time trying to remember not to feel guilty about it. A lot of people who are pastors, at least maybe that's not true. A lot of the people that I was trained to look up to who are pastors tend to be these very like kind of alpha bro people who are like, I wake up at 3:30 and I exercise for 2 hours. And I'm like, I don't do any of those things. And so I've spent a lot of my life feeling like I honestly almost tend to avoid any talk of habits or disciplines or practices because it just provokes guilt in me. But I'm trying to get out of that way of thinking and into something better. And so as I've been asking, what would it look like for me to build my morning liturgy around something that's a little bit more Jesus-centric and life-giving, I've started doing this. First of all, I started waking up at 5:30 a.m. Now, I don't know what that sounds like for you. Maybe that sounds like hell itself, or maybe that sounds like a blessed relief because you get up earlier. But that's 30 minutes earlier than I was before. And the reason is I realized that by the time I did my stretching, because I'm at the age now where apparently stretching is not optional, but now mandatory, after I do that and start getting around, that I have already run into the buzzsaw of busyness of I have to help get my kids out the door. So I've backed it up 30 minutes. So that I have time before anything, as I'm doing stretches, I just start praying, like, God, would you center my heart and mind on the reality that you are here and that the best thing I can do is experience you today. And then the coffee hits, because coffee is good and a gift from God, and we say thank you, Lord, for that. I make the eggs for the family. I do help get the kids out the door. But then what I try to do, and this one's a little fluid because the kid situation can be a little fluid in terms of how well they're doing at getting ready for the day, but I try to make sure that I get at least one, like read through one psalm, because my kids are old enough now that I can kind of be like, you go do your things and I'm going to be here at the table. And then regardless of what happens, once we get them to school and I come back, what I used to do, the first thing that I used to do is just immediately rush out the door and start getting to work. And what I've decided to do now is to spend 20 minutes post dropping the kids off at school, pre-work, and that 20 minutes is dedicated toward me just being still and praying through my day. And inviting God, is like, God, whatever it is that you want to do, whatever it is you want to be about, I want to participate in that. Every once in a while, if I'm feeling particularly ambitious, I might journal. That's a hard habit for me, but I'm trying to get in the habit of it because God really speaks to me through that, I've found. And then while I'm driving, wherever it is that I'm driving to, I've tried to make the habit of, rather than turning on my podcast, that's going to be like for me, it's usually like the funny friends talking about movies podcast. Rather than doing that, I'm going to try to center my mind's attention on something that has to do with Jesus. And in all of this, I'm not doing this out of guilt or pressure or shame. I'm doing this because I want to experience life. Because my liturgy is saying something that's true about reality. And I want to root my mind and my heart and everything I am in what is most true. Because the more I'm rooted in what is most true, the more I'm experiencing life. And so what I want to talk to you about tonight is just like, what would that look like for you? What would it look like for you to build morning routines, morning rituals, morning habits, morning liturgies that are helping center you in the presence of Jesus? And maybe for you, you're asking the question of like, yeah, that sounds good, but why would I actually do any of that? And I have a couple of reasons for you. The first is this. If your current liturgy, if your current rhythm is working out well for you and providing the life for you that you want, then okay, fine, stick with it. That's okay. And maybe for some of you, you've already done all of this and you're already down that path. I would just say, awesome, that's great. But for a lot of us, if we're honest, we are going through our days and there is an aimlessness to the way that we are going through our days. And then we wake up and we wonder, why does my life seem so uncentered? Why does my life seem so unfocused? Why does it seem like I am not living the life that I know that I am made to live? And it's because we have had a liturgy that has crept in over time that has been largely dictated to us by people that do not have our best interest at heart and that have no idea who they are either. And what has happened is we've adopted that. And so why would we do this? Because I don't know if this will appeal to all of you. There's some of you, your personalities are going to be like, that doesn't do anything for me. And there's going to be some of you who are like, yeah, let's go. It's like, because like, honestly, part of the reason for me is I'm tired of a bunch of massive corporations trying to manipulate me into what they want me to be about and do. And I'm like, no, you don't get to decide my life for me. Because I want to be someone who's present and able to love generously and well the people that I love most. And what I found is the more rooted in God I am, especially the more I can set out in the morning to be rooted in God, the more love I have to give to the people around me. Because sometimes I hang out with people like my friend Kelton, who I used to wait tables with when I was just trying to make ends meet. And we didn't connect for 6 years. And yesterday we got reconnected. And his life is a freaking mess. And he's addicted, and this relationship he has with, they have 6 kids, and I'm hearing him talk about how he was blackout drunk the day after Christmas, and his wife, I don't even know what happened while he was blackout drunk, but his wife called the cops on him, and he just got out of rehab. And because when I show up in that conversation with Kelton, Kelton does not need me. Kelton needs me to be centered and present with the Holy Spirit who is working in and through me so that when I'm in that conversation, I can be in a space where I've tried to make space through the liturgy of my day, where I'm in a place where I am connected to God and in touch with what God is doing, so I can step into whatever has happened in that moment, because my friend Kelton needs Jesus. And I want to be present to be able to be aware of whatever Jesus might be doing. And in all of that, what I want to remind us, and we'll close with this, is that in the same way that the Hebrew people were a part of God's blessing, where he's like, I have created you to be a separate people, but you're going to be a blessing to the entire world because you're going to show what a world that operates different than empire looks like. In the very same way, our world, I don't know if you've noticed it, things are crazy. You probably haven't. Yeah, you watch the news. You're the one person who said you look at the news. So you know, talk to him afterwards. Things are crazy out there. Huh? Oh, don't read the news. Yeah, don't start now. Yeah, it's a bad time to jump in. No, our world's way of doing things, our world's liturgy, it's not working, y'all. We're tearing ourselves apart at the seams, and we have no earthly clue what to do. And if we are going to step into what God, if you are here and you're a follower of Jesus, then God, through his Spirit living in you, has called you to step in and be the place where heaven and earth are reconnected through Jesus being in you. And through that, you are the person that shows the rest of the world what it looks like to find hope, to find a way out of the mess that we are in. But for us to step into that calling, it involves us developing intentionality and leaning into liturgies that reconnect us to what is true about God and what is true about us. So my question here tonight for you is this. It's a simple question. It's like, what are 1 or 2 things that you could change and how you structure your mornings. Or maybe it's not for you. Maybe it's your evenings. Maybe you're a night person, whatever. What are one or two changes that you can make that would root you in the reality or in the belief that there is a God who holds all things together, who has your best interest at heart, and wants to move through you to bring healing into this world? So let's pray. And if you have kind of felt in all of this a nudging of that maybe God is talking to you through all this, then what I would just invite you to do right now is ask God, like, God, what are a couple of changes that you would want to invite me, a couple of habits, a couple of additions to my liturgy that I could make? And maybe it is rooting your morning and like reading a psalm or reading something from the Gospels of Jesus. Or maybe it's just making time to be still and just be in God's presence and pray about whatever's on your heart and mind, or just invite him into the day that you're about to head into. What is one change God might be inviting you to make right now? So God, we sang this earlier, but we sang about wanting to be your hands and be your feet, and how our faith doesn't really offer much if it is not a faith that leads us to love the world around us, especially those who are the lost and the forgotten and the marginalized and the oppressed. But God, I'm pretty convinced that for us to do that, it doesn't just happen. I think sometimes I just wait for you to change something in me, but it takes intentionality. And so as I'm saying all this, I confess, God, I am someone who struggles to form liturgies that are built around you, and I feel the resistance of a world that's built against that around me. But God, I want to wake up tomorrow and experience your goodness. I want to root the liturgy of my life in the beauty of who you are. Would you guide me gently into that? And I pray for each person here, God, would you call them more and more into the life that you offer?